question, I would say half of my fellow students were writing master's theses on whether NATO, should there be a NATO, does it need to exist absent the Soviet Union? And there were no really good answers to that at the time. It existed, it had bureaucratic inertia, it was an organization in place, had capability and force structure. So the assumption was, of course, it should continue to exist, but its real next test the Europeans themselves, and this will again come to the present day a little bit, which was the wars in the Balkans. The Balkan Wars were a great test case for Europe. What's happening with the disintegration of Yugoslavia, the breakup into wars based on ethnic lines, and the possible genocidal activities of different ethnic groups against each other. Here on the continent of Europe, within several decades of the end of the Second World War. And at the time, the Europeans, the Western Europeans, had a thing they called the WEU, the Western European Union. And that is, well, maybe we Europeans should act alone without this transatlantic impetus, without the American influence on it, to stop this. And what they found was they could not act. They could not act. And in fact, they found themselves politically fighting each other. The Germans, the Austrians immediately recognized Slovenia, Croatia, and there was dark talk in France, and about this walk to Tonique, because they were worried about their own separatist movements with the Basque and the south part of France. And we found was that they were all arguing about the specifics, and there was no unified vision. And the one organization that provided some sort of unified vision of action was NATO itself, in respect to its air operations in Kosovo. Done independent of the UN Security Council, strictly because of the scope of the humanitarian disaster that was unfolding in Europe. So then NATO Supreme Commander Wesley Clark, later became presidential candidate in the United States. He led a campaign against Kosovo, put it into that. Still a very difficult region, by the way. I don't think we have final solutions there, but put it into the immediate and proximate violence that occurred there. Did it with this transatlantic relationship with American leadership. So the first test bed for a post-NATO security environment in Europe, to a certain extent, was failed by the Europeans, to a certain extent. Which then brought back this whole issue of what is the American presence in NATO for? Is it that first mission, which is to look at an outside enemy that is clearly identified, outside threat, and to interpose American forces against it, like the Soviet Union? Or is it to insert itself among the Europeans themselves? That is a pacifier among the Europeans themselves. Because what we find in the world is, not so much in Europe, but in Asia, we find it in Europe also. People, whether they trust us or not, the United States, they tend to trust us more than they trust each other. We find this phenomenon all the time. People come to us and say, we want you to help us because those guys next to us, and they're really difficult. Okay, so that was 1990s, a real challenge to NATO, a real philosophical challenge, and at a kind of formal philosophical level, the challenge was never answered, but at the facts on the ground level, the actual activity level, it was kind of answered. NATO still had a role. There was a need for transatlantic leadership and transatlantic ties. Now, skip ahead to 2001, September 11th, 2001, the attacks, the terrorist attacks in the United States. I was on my second tour, by the way. I was a vice consul of the U.S. Embassy in Trinidad in the Southern Caribbean, and I was doing visa interviews on that day. People in Poland don't like visas, but we do visa interviews all over the world, and Trinidad is a particularly hot refusal post. And I remember I was actually watching the plane pilot in the building over the shoulder of the person I was interviewing. There's a television on the waiting lobby for the visa applicants. 9/11 happens, and NATO, for the first time in its history, for the very first time in its history, declares or revokes Article 5. Article 5, if you don't familiar with it, in the Polish conception, Article 5 is the single most important part of the Washington Treaty, which means an attack upon one member is an attack upon all members. And when you invoke Article 5, the alliance itself will, as an alliance, then seek to defend or protect one of its members that's been attacked by some outside agency. So Article 5 was invoked for the very first time. And the question came for NATO, well, then how do we execute Article 5? We decided that there's some threat, the United States was attacked, it's a member of the alliance, we the alliance will do something about it. But the problem with transnational terrorism is it doesn't carry calling cards, we don't know where the guys exactly came from. Well, we did know that they were trained, promoted, and supported by Taliban regime in Afghanistan. But whatever else we didn't know, we did know that. And so the decision was made very shortly to engage in hostilities in Afghanistan. And the question became, who should engage in hostilities in Afghanistan? Should it just be the United States, as the United States, because we were attacked on our soil? Or should it also be NATO as And from that was the generation of ISAF, the National Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan, NATO command. So you have these actually two different organizations in Afghanistan. You have American forces working just as American forces. And then you have NATO operating as ISAF. So sometimes people say, well, NATO's got an expeditionary. NATO's operating outside of its own borders. NATO is looking for a mission. It's looking for something to define it. But we don't see it that way. We see it as an invocation of Article 5, an attack on one of NATO members. We see it as a formation of NATO, not some sort of weird tertiary mission of NATO. Okay, so we became involved in Afghanistan. Poland becomes involved in Afghanistan. And I think that 3 years before Warsaw, experienced the Polish government about their thinking about why they might want to do this. And there's two reasons why Poland becomes involved with ISAF. And Poland's the 6th largest contributor to ISAF. Poland has 2,600 soldiers in Gazny province. It's one of our strategic partners in Afghanistan. There's no question about that. Poland calculates on two different levels, right? In our mission originally, you have alliances for different reasons. One is shared values, one is shared interests, one is shared history. On the shared values thing, the idea of we're going there on some sort of moral crusade to do the right thing, I think most Polish officials would be reluctant to say that. I think the foreign minister might say something like that because he himself had been to Afghanistan as a reporter, as a journalist during the Soviet occupation, wrote a book about it, strong feelings about Afghanistan at a personal level. Most officials would say this is not a question of values in Afghanistan. We think it is, by the way. We invoke shared values all the time, but Polish officials don't. But what Polish officials would say is we have shared interests in there. And here's the Polish calculation. They would say, NATO, with Article 5, is the principal security guarantee for Poland, were there to be some sort of security threat on Poland's borders, its eastern borders in particular. How do we guarantee that that will actually occur? It's just a piece of paper right now, the Polish conception. Our conception is not just a piece of paper, it's a solemn commitment. We really believe in Article 5. Okay? But the Polish line, with its experience in 1939, when it had international agreements and the Western powers did not come to its assistance in time, and it was occupied for 50 years because of that. How do we make that real? Well, we can't let NATO lose credibility in this fight that's involved. We can't let it lose in Afghanistan. It has to be successful there. So Poland made a decision very early that Polish troops needed to commit themselves to NATO's success in Afghanistan and to the United States' success, not just in Afghanistan, but in Iraq, which came later. Because the United States is the principal supplier of troops, military hardware, finance, that really underpins all of NATO defense efforts. And so Poland very quickly, with 1,000 troops, then 1,200, 2,000, and then a year and a half ago, went up to 2,600. And then I think from reading the newspaper 2 days ago with the defense minister, we'll probably go back down by a couple hundred troops, maybe at the end of this year, as all of the countries start to transition to a training mission. We'll try to exit in 2014 in some way. So that's kind of NATO adopts this new mission, this new kind of out-of-area mission. But then the danger for NATO members like Poland is NATO focused on the ability to no longer fight at home where required. So in the lead-up to the Lisbon summit in November of last year, Poland in NATO and with other NATO allies said we want to see several things happen so we can continue to support the alliance. We want to see the alliance do better contingency planning here for anything that would happen in Eastern Europe, the Baltics, Poland. We want to see some movement of force structure or basing the Polish soil. We want to see better exercises. We want to see real concrete actions. And all of those were agreed on at the Lisbon summit. So I think even though NATO's found a role where it doesn't matter if someone attacks a NATO member, it doesn't matter if they are neighbors to NATO, they can be somewhere else in the world. There is also this renewed emphasis, renewed effort on what happens actually in the alliance itself and territorial defense. And of course we support that. We don't see it as an opposition, we see it as the same thing. So that's really kind of where NATO is right now as far as its force structure. Now, NATO did something very important in November I do want to mention because this also involves Poland. NATO made a decision that it would adopt territorial missile defense as an alliance mission, as an alliance priority. The United States has been negotiating missile defenses with Poland since 2007. We came to an agreement in 2008, it was the Missile Defense Agreement, and then this last November, NATO as an alliance adopted missile defense as an alliance mission. So that means that not only will we have 2 land-based sites in Europe that the United States provides, one in Poland and one in Romania, we'll also have national missile defenses provided by member countries. So I think that for Poland's a very important thing, because it means for them we will not walk away from our commitments on missile defense where there are changes in administration and change in U.S. government. So I think that's also an important thing. As far as the future of NATO, we're back to the 1990s arguments, within NATO. I think that we have a shared commonality of values. I think all of our NATO members believe that. We see the world similar ways. We represent a certain civilization in the world, a certain worldview that we want to defend. We do have shared interests. And that NATO as an institution is an institution with means, the ability to carry out missions in advance of our shared interests and values and our shared history. So I don't think NATO will go away or diminish. Certainly, the sort of thing that happened in Kosovo, for example, only NATO seemed to be able to act. May happen, I don't know, it's not been decided, may happen in North Africa. This humanitarian disaster in the littoral of North Africa, you may say NATO may get involved with that. It's not because it's a core mission, but because it has the capability and the means in the world to do it. So I think the future for NATO is one where you'll see it still being useful in the world. And Poland will still, I think, continue to rank NATO as one of its three central pillars of its defense strategy going into the future. And right now, it looks at the EU for economic support. It looks at NATO for Article 5 guarantees and has the bilateral relationship with the United States that we provide most of the forces with that. So with that, before too many people fall asleep in the room, let me in my remarks, it's been about 20 minutes, and perhaps we can move to the next speaker. Thank you.